Since 19th of July, 1943, the air above the Italian hills shimmered with heat and gunfire. The 7th Armored Division had rolled straight into a trap. German anti-tank guns hidden among the olive trees were waiting. Within minutes, 2 British Shermans burst into flames, black smoke curling skyward as their crews scrambled for cover. 3 entire units were pinned down in a valley with no way out. The road behind was cratered. The path ahead was burning steel. Inside his tank, Captain Roland Pierce wiped sweat and soot from his eyes. His crew looked at him, waiting for orders. The radio crackled with panic. One unit begging for artillery, another screaming coordinates before being cut off mid-sentence. Pierce knew they had less than 5 minutes before the Germans flanked them completely. He checked his ammunition, only 2 shells left. Not nearly enough to fight their way out. Then Pierce noticed something. The Germans were firing from elevated ground, using the valley smoke to spot flashes from the British guns. Every time a Sherman fired, it revealed its position. That's when Pierce made a decision that went against every rule in the book. He ordered his driver, "Load smoke, full canisters, all of them. Sir, command said to conserve smoke." "Do it!" he barked. The crew obeyed. Thick white clouds began to pour from the tank's exhaust and launchers. Soon, the entire valley was swallowed by fog. British and German alike couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Radios filled with angry voices demanding visibility. The Germans stopped firing. They couldn't tell where the British were. Pierce didn't wait. He slammed open the turret hatch, took out his compass, and shouted directions to the other crews over short-range radio. "Follow my engine sound. Keep close." His Sherman crawled forward through the blinding smoke, tracks grinding over shell casings and burning metal. Behind him, 3 crippled units followed the sound of his engine. Blind, terrified, but trusting him completely. A few minutes later, Pierce spotted a dry creek bed running between 2 ridges. He ordered everyone to turn hard right and drive through it. The tanks roared down the slope, vanishing from German sight. By the time the smoke cleared, the valley was empty. The Germans fired shells into empty ground, unaware that the British had escaped through the creek and were already regrouping 2 miles away. When the division finally reached safety, Pierce was summoned to headquarters. The commanding officer threw the report on his desk. "You released 6 full canisters of smoke without authorization. Do you realize that's against procedure?" Pierce, exhausted and still covered in soot, replied quietly, "Yes, sir, but it saved 63 men." There was silence. Then the officer nodded slowly. "Next time," he said, "warn us before you break the rules." That night, as the sun set over the hills, the men who had escaped gathered around Pierce's Sherman. They painted a small white cloud on the tank's armor, a symbol of the smoke trick that turned disaster into survival. From that day, his crew was known across the regiment by one name, the Ghost Platoon. The unauthorized move became a story told in every mess tent and every campfire. How one commander's defiance and a wall of smoke had outsmarted an army. Dawn broke over the Italian countryside, turning the smoke-blackened sky into a pale gold. The Ghost Platoon lay hidden in the ruins of an abandoned farmhouse, their tanks camouflaged beneath torn canvas and olive branches. Captain Pierce hadn't slept. His hands still trembled from the previous day's escape, but he knew the Germans wouldn't stay blind for long. They would hunt him. The radio hissed faintly with static before a voice broke through. "Enemy patrols sweeping North Ridge. Armored column sighted." The Germans were regrouping fast, and worse, they had intercepted partial radio chatter from British command. If they located Pierce's battered group, they'd be crushed before reinforcements arrived. Pierce crouched beside his tank and studied the terrain. The farmhouse sat on low ground, surrounded by wheat fields that sloped toward a narrow ravine. He traced a line on his map. If they push from the north, they'll come straight down this slope. "Perfect kill zone," he muttered. His gunner, Corporal Evans, frowned. "Sir, We've got barely enough shells to hold off one tank, let alone a column." Pierce looked up, a spark in his eyes. "Then we make them see what isn't there." He ordered every tank crew to spread out wreckage, damaged tracks, burnt helmets, scrap metal, across the ravine's entrance, making it appear like a destroyed unit. Then he used his remaining smoke rounds not to hide, but to fake retreat. Each tank fired smoke diagonally across the ridge, masking their true positions while giving the illusion they were fleeing deeper south. By noon, the German column rolled forward confidently. 5 Panzerwerfers leading, infantry trucks following. Their commander scanned through binoculars and laughed. "Engländer kaputt," he sneered, seeing the scattered wreckage. But the moment the lead panzer crested the slope, the trap was sprung. Pierce's Sherman, hidden under thick brush, roared to life. The first shell slammed into the Germans' lead tank, blasting it sideways into the ravine. Evans reloaded instantly. Second shot struck the following panzer's turret, sending flames bursting from the hatch. Smoke from Pierce's earlier ruse now worked against the Germans. Their formation broke, unable to see where the British were firing from. The valley became chaos. Screams, engines grinding, gunfire echoing off the hills. One British crewman yelled through the radio, "We're out of shells!" Pierce answered calmly, "Then ram them." And they did. A crippled Sherman lurched forward, smashing its hull into a panzer's flank. The German crew bailed out in panic. Machine guns rattled. Evans spotted an enemy officer waving for retreat and fired his final round. The explosion silenced the valley. When the smoke cleared, the Ghost Platoon had done the impossible again. 5 German tanks destroyed, 0 British losses. Hours later, command finally reached them. The colonel's voice came through, "Pierce, you disobeyed direct withdrawal orders. Again. Care to explain?" Pierce simply replied, "Sir, we couldn't withdraw. We were already surrounded." There was silence, then static, then one sentence. "Good work, Ghost Platoon." That night, the men laughed quietly around a fire, their uniforms torn and faces black with soot. They knew tomorrow would bring another battle, another order to follow, or to break. But for now, under the Italian stars, they were alive because one man refused to surrender to fear or procedure. And somewhere in the distance, across the hills they had escaped, the Germans whispered a new rumor among their ranks about the British tanks that vanished in smoke and struck like ghosts from nowhere. The sun burned high above the shattered ridges when new orders arrived. The Ghost Platoon was to rejoin the main British line at Cassino, 30 miles through hostile territory, crawling with German patrols. Fuel was low, ammo nearly gone, and every man bore the weight of exhaustion and survival. Captain Roland Pierce stood beside his Sherman, map unfolded on the hood. "We can't go back through the main road," he said quietly. "Too obvious. The Germans will expect that." His driver, Miller, spat dust from his mouth. "So what then, sir? Fly?" Pierce smirked faintly. "No. We disappear again." He had learned something from the last 2 days. Fear could be a weapon. If the Germans thought the Ghost Platoon was still prowling behind their lines, they'd waste time and soldiers chasing shadows. Pierce's mind began to turn. He ordered each crew to drain a few gallons of fuel and soak the wrecks they had left behind earlier. Then, under the cloak of night, they lit them up. From miles away, German outposts saw the glow of fires and heard distant engine echoes. The ghosts had returned. Radios buzzed with frantic reports. "Enemy armor moving north!" In reality, the platoon was heading southwest, crawling through dried riverbeds and narrow farm roads, engines barely above idle. The illusion worked perfectly, but as dawn crept over the hills, disaster struck. One of the Shermans hit a buried mine near a vineyard. The blast ripped off its track and sent flames licking through its hull. The crew scrambled out, one man screaming with a wounded leg. The explosion shattered their silence and alerted every German scout nearby. Within minutes, mortar rounds began to fall. Dirt erupted around them as Pierce yelled into the radio, "Cover fire! Move the wounded!" The Ghost Platoon returned fire with their few remaining shells, the booming guns echoing between the hills. But it was clear they couldn't stay. Then, amid the chaos, Pierce noticed the vineyard's terrain. Narrow rows, dense with vines, sloping down into a gully. "Reverse the tanks into the vines!" he shouted. The crews hesitated but obeyed. Their Shermans crashed through the grape rows, trampling vines and splintering posts until they were nearly invisible beneath the canopy of leaves. The Germans, thinking the British had retreated again, advanced cautiously across the open field, straight into the trap. Pierce gave a sharp order. "Fire everything we've got left!" The Shermans erupted at once. Cannon fire tore through the air. Grapevines shook with the shock waves. The first German truck exploded in a cloud of fire, and the others broke formation, soldiers diving for cover. Smoke and dust blinded their counterattack. The Ghost Platoon's final shells tore through 2 armored cars before silence fell. When the last echo faded, Pierce's crew climbed out, coughing and laughing in disbelief. They had survived again. The vineyard burned behind them as they loaded the wounded onto one surviving truck. Pierce looked back at the smoldering vines, the broken tanks, the fields littered with twisted metal. "We leave the smoke behind," he murmured, "and let them keep chasing ghosts." By dusk, they finally reached the outskirts of Cassino, exhausted, half-starved, and nearly weaponless. The men of the 7th Armored had been declared lost 2 days earlier. Now, covered in ash and mud, they rolled through the British checkpoint like survivors of a legend. A young officer at the gate saluted and whispered, "Are you the Ghost Platoon?" Pierce smiled wearily. "No," he said. "We're just what's left of them." But that night, as artillery rumbled in the distance, the men of Cassino swore they saw white smoke drifting across the fields, and they knew the ghosts were still out there. Cassino was supposed to be rest and regrouping, but the Ghost Platoon never really rested. Their arrival caused whispers in every tent and trench. Men spoke of the tanks that vanished in smoke and returned from hell. Mechanics gathered around their battered Shermans, bullet holes patched with mud and vine leaves still tangled in the tracks. Every mark told a story. Captain Roland Pierce sat in the field hospital tent, getting his arm bandaged. His body was bruised, but his mind was still on the battlefield. Across from him, Colonel Whitaker watched silently, holding a report file. "You disobeyed direct movement orders 3 times, Captain," the colonel said finally. "And yet," he glanced up, "your platoon saved 70 men, destroyed 8 enemy vehicles, and crippled a German pursuit unit." Pierce said nothing. He simply stared at the ground. Whitaker continued, voice lowering, "Command is divided on whether to court-martial you or promote you." Pierce gave a tired grin. "Depends on whether you want soldiers or ghosts, sir." The colonel closed the file. "Get your tanks refueled. High Command wants to see if your luck holds one more time." That night, a messenger arrived with sealed orders. The Ghost Platoon was to lead a decoy assault east of Cassino to draw German attention away from the main offensive. It was suicide, bait duty. But Pierce didn't hesitate. "We've been ghosts long enough," he said. "Let's haunt them one last time." At dawn, their engines roared once more. The tanks rolled out under gray skies, the crews exhausted but fiercely loyal. As they moved toward the German front, Pierce spotted the same rolling fog from the valley days before. He smiled faintly. "Nature's on our side again." He ordered his men to load smoke rounds and prepare false signals. The plan was simple. They would simulate a full armored push, make the enemy believe an entire division was attacking, then vanish before being surrounded. By mid-morning, the plan was in motion. Smoke shells burst across the valley floor, thick white curtains hiding their small number. Radio chatter filled the air with fake coordinates, ghost voices of units that didn't exist. German artillery began firing wildly, shelling empty hills and phantom tanks. But fate had other plans. A German reconnaissance plane spotted the real tanks beneath the smoke. Within minutes, shells began raining directly on their position. The ground erupted around them. One Sherman was hit, flipped on its side. Another caught fire. "Pierce, we're losing cover!" shouted Evans. Pierce climbed up the turret, coughing from the smoke and heat. His eyes locked on a narrow pass between two cliffs. "Through there!" he yelled. "We punch through now or die here!" The surviving tanks surged forward, engines screaming. Shells whistled overhead. One hit close enough to knock Pierce back inside the turret, ears ringing. Through the haze, the cliffs loomed ahead. The tanks charged into the narrow gap, scraping stone and blasting anything that moved. When they broke through the other side, sunlight hit them. And silence. The Germans had fired everything into the empty valley, convinced the British were still inside. Pierce's tanks, reduced to half, emerged like ghosts reborn. Evans leaned out of the hatch, laughing hysterically. "We did it again! They can't kill us!" Pierce didn't answer. He stared back at the distant smoke where his fallen tanks burned. "No," he said softly. "They already did. We just don't know it yet." By nightfall, they reached friendly lines again. The Ghost Platoon had once more vanished into legend. A story soldiers whispered before battle, about tanks that moved with the mist and a commander who defied every order, every fear, and even death itself. And somewhere, under the quiet Italian moon, the smoke from their last stand drifted like spirits, silent, defiant, and unbroken. The night was eerily calm after the storm. The Ghost Platoon had limped back to camp, 3 tanks left from the original 12. Their engines hissed like wounded beasts cooling in the dark. Mechanics moved quietly, their faces pale as they stared at the scars of battle. Melted armor, shattered optics, bullet-pocked hulls. Captain Roland Pierce sat alone outside his tank, staring into the embers of a dying fire. Around him, the camp was silent except for distant artillery rumbling from Casino. His mind was not on the victory or survival. It was on the men who hadn't made it back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal tag. Corporal Evans's. The gunner who had saved them twice, now buried under the smoke he helped create. Pierce clenched the tag in his hand, whispering, "You were right. They can't kill ghosts." Before dawn, a courier jeep skidded into camp. "Urgent orders for Captain Pierce," the driver shouted. Pierce opened the envelope under the flicker of a lantern. The message was short. "Enemy reserves moving toward Casino from the north. We need delay, 12 hours minimum. Ghost Platoon to intercept." The men stared at him when he read it aloud. They were battered, outnumbered, and running on fumes. Sergeant Miller shook his head. "Sir, we've got 3 tanks. 3. They'll crush us in 5 minutes." Pierce looked at them. Mud-streaked faces, bloodshot eyes, men who had already given everything. Then, in a calm voice, he said, "We only need to look like a whole army for 12 hours. By sunrise, the Ghost Platoon was on the move again. They rolled through the misty hills, using every trick they'd learned. They dragged burned tank shells behind them to leave dozens of track marks. They scattered broken helmets and radio parts along the trails to mimic retreating forces. And every few miles, they fired a single smoke shell, the signal of their haunting. The Germans advanced cautiously, their scouts reporting multiple armored units. The illusion was perfect. When the enemy finally reached the valley, Pierce ordered his tanks to fan out and fire into the fog, 1 round every few minutes from shifting positions. Echoes bounced through the hills, turning 3 Shermans into what sounded like 30. But soon, the Germans adjusted. Mortar fire began to creep closer. One British tank was hit. Flames erupted. The explosion lit the valley like dawn. Pierce's radio crackled. "Sir, they're advancing in full force," Pierce shouted. "Then it's time for the last smoke trick." He ordered every remaining canister, shell, and spare fuel barrel emptied into the fields and ignited. The entire valley turned into a white inferno. Thick, blinding clouds rolling across the hills. The Germans stopped firing. They couldn't tell where the British were or how many there were. For 6 hours, the Ghost Platoon's smoke held them back. Radio intercepts later revealed German commanders arguing, convinced they faced an entire division. When reinforcements finally arrived at dusk, the British troops found only burning wrecks, empty helmets, and faint tire marks leading south. Pierce's platoon had vanished again. Later that night, a weary British soldier stumbled into headquarters with soot on his face and a torn flag tied around his arm. The officer asked his name. He simply replied, "Ghost Platoon, sir." Mission complete. The colonel blinked. "Where's Captain Pierce?" The soldier looked down, his voice almost a whisper. "Last seen driving his tank into the smoke. Said he'd cover our retreat." The colonel didn't respond. He just stared toward the northern hills, where a faint white haze still drifted in the moonlight. And for years after, soldiers told the same story around campfires, that in the chaos of Casino, when the world burned and hope was gone, a lone tank rolled into the mist and never came out. Some swore they saw its silhouette through the smoke on foggy mornings, an old Sherman with a white ghost painted on the side, watching over the battlefield. The Ghost Platoon had vanished, but its legend never did. At dawn, the battlefield was quiet. Too quiet. The air hung heavy with the smell of burnt fuel and drifting smoke. British scouts moved cautiously through the valley, their boots crunching over empty shell casings and charred earth. Somewhere beyond the haze, an engine still ticked faintly. "Hold on," one of them whispered. "You hear that?" They followed the sound to a crater half swallowed by smoke. There, half buried in rubble, sat Captain Pierce's Sherman, its hull blackened, turret half melted, but somehow still upright. The gun barrel was bent from heat, the armor scarred and twisted. Yet the white ghost emblem on the side remained untouched, clear as the day it was painted. The hatch creaked open. Inside, they found Pierce slumped over the controls, burned and motionless, his hand still gripping the radio mic. The transmission log beside him showed a single final message, scrawled in shaking handwriting, "Tell them." The smoke held. When the message reached command, the camp fell silent. Soldiers who had never met him stood still as the news spread. The man who had cheated death 3 times had finally disappeared into the fog he had mastered. That evening, Colonel Whitaker visited the wreck himself. He stood before the burned tank and whispered, "You broke every rule we had, Pierce, and you rewrote them all." Orders were given to recover the tank, but the mechanics refused. "It's not right," one said. "That thing's more ghost than machine now." Instead, they left it there, a monument amid the valley of smoke. For months, British and Allied troops passing through the sector would leave small offerings, spent shells, ration tins, or their unit badges beside the ruined Sherman. They called it the Smoke Sentinel, but the story didn't end there. Weeks later, strange reports began to surface. German patrols along the northern ridges claimed they had seen a lone British tank prowling the mists at night. "It doesn't fire," one prisoner said nervously. "It just moves slow, like it's watching." Some even swore they heard a faint radio transmission through static, a calm voice repeating, "Hold the line, keep to the smoke." Back at Allied command, the legend grew. New recruits heard tales of the Ghost Platoon, a unit that could vanish into fog and strike from nowhere. Veterans swore that when the mist was thickest, you could still see a faint light flickering inside the old tank's turret. like a lantern guiding lost men home. By the end of the war, the Ghost Platoon had become a name spoken with quiet reverence, not just for the men who fought, but for the spirit of defiance they left behind. Years later, in 1951, a group of engineers clearing the Casino Hills stumbled upon the same Sherman, still standing guard in its crater. The vines had grown over it, flowers blooming through the cracks in the armor. One of the men brushed away the dirt and found the faded white ghost symbol beneath, still visible. And as he stepped back, the wind shifted, carrying a wisp of dust and smoke through the morning air. It curled around the tank like a shroud, and for a brief, fleeting second, he could have sworn he heard a voice through the silence. "Keep to the smoke." Then it was gone, leaving nothing behind but the whisper of a legend that would never die. The sun rose blood-red over Casino's battered hills. For the first time in weeks, there was no gunfire, only wind weaving through twisted metal and scorched soil. Yet, deep in the Valley of Ghosts, something stirred. At dawn, a British patrol sent to recover wrecks noticed strange tracks in the dirt, fresh tank treads. The problem? No Allied unit had moved through that sector since Pierce's last stand. Lieutenant Harris, the patrol leader, frowned as he traced the marks with his boot. "These are new. Last night? Maybe a few hours old?" The men looked at each other uneasily. The valley had long been abandoned, a cursed zone, they said, where radios crackled on their own and fog refused to lift. As the patrol pushed deeper, the fog grew thicker, curling between the trees like smoke from an unseen fire. Then, through the mist, they saw it. A faint white silhouette of a Sherman tank, engine whispering low. "Identify yourself," Harris shouted. No response. The tank rolled slowly across the ridge, its outline flickering in and out of the haze. And just as suddenly, it was gone. No sound, no tracks, no echo. Only the smell of diesel and burnt cordite lingered. The men reported what they saw, but the officers dismissed it as exhaustion. "The mind sees ghosts where the body's too tired to think," one colonel said. Yet, that night, the same thing happened again. This time, to a German recon unit. The Germans described it differently. "We heard engines," one prisoner later told interrogators. "But not normal. They echoed, like many tanks. But there was only one. We fired flares. The fog glowed white. And then we saw the mark." "The mark?" the officer asked. The prisoner's voice trembled. "A ghost. Painted on the side. And a voice on the radio, an English voice. It said, 'Stay in the smoke.'" After that, even the Germans stopped patrolling the valley at night. They called it Geistertal, the Valley of Ghosts. Weeks passed. The front moved north, but rumors of the Ghost Platoon spread through every unit. Soldiers claimed that when battles went bad, a white haze would appear, and within it, the echo of tank engines rumbling just beyond sight. Some said it was superstition. Others said it was something else. Years later, in 1945, during the final push into Germany, a British captain named Ellis was pinned down near Aachen. His unit was surrounded, their radios jammed, artillery closing in. Just as hope seemed lost, the mist rolled in, thick, sudden, unnatural. Through the haze, Ellis swore he saw a shadow move across the field. A single Sherman tank, its ghost emblem glowing faintly in the gloom. It fired once, twice, and somehow, miraculously, the German guns fell silent. When the fog lifted, the tank was gone, and the road ahead was clear. Ellis never forgot that sight. After the war, he tracked down records of the Ghost Platoon. He found mention of Pierce, of the final battle, and of the words written in the logbook. "Tell them." The smoke held. He visited the Casino Valley years later, long after peace had returned. Wildflowers grew among the rusted wrecks. The air was still. But when Ellis stood before the old Sherman, vines wrapping its sides, the ghost emblem faint but visible, he could feel something watching. The wind picked up. A faint smell of diesel filled the air, and through the rust and vines, the radio inside the turret clicked once, then crackled faintly to life. A voice, thin as a whisper of static, drifted through. "Hold the line. Keep to the smoke." Ellis froze, eyes wide. The voice faded, replaced by silence. But the air still shimmered faintly, as if the valley itself remembered. And somewhere, beyond the fields of Casino, in the drifting mist of old battlefields, the Ghost Platoon still moved, unseen, eternal, guarding the living with their smoke and silence, because legends never die. They just fade into the fog. The war was over. Europe was rebuilding. Casino had become quiet again, a place of ruins and wildflowers, where tourists sometimes wandered without realizing how many ghosts lay beneath their feet. But one man could never leave it behind. Major Ellis returned to Casino in 1958, 15 years after he'd last seen that strange fog on the battlefield. He had retired from the army, but the memory of that single white Sherman, appearing from nowhere, saving his men, haunted his dreams. He needed to see it again. Locals told him not to go alone. The valley, they said, was cursed. Radios went dead, compasses spun, and sometimes, at night, engines could still be heard where no road existed. But Ellis only smiled and said quietly, "He's still out there." By dusk, he stood in the valley. The same air, the same silence. His boots sank into soil that had once burned under tank fire. The outline of the old Sherman loomed ahead, half-buried, rusted, blanketed in ivy. The ghost emblem, though faded, was still visible, pale against the steel. Ellis climbed onto the hull, brushing away leaves. Inside, the air was cold. The seat was empty, the control levers stiff with age. He found the old radio still bolted to the side, cracked and blackened by fire. It was dead. He sighed, set his canteen down, and whispered, "Captain Pierce, if you can hear me—" "Thank you." For a moment, nothing happened. Just the wind whispering through the trees. Then, click, the radio light flickered. Static filled the cabin. Ellis froze, staring. Then, a voice. Faint. Distant. Like it had traveled through time itself. "Report position. This is Ghost Actual. All units accounted for. Smoke deployed." Ellis's heart pounded. He grabbed the radio. "Pierce? Captain Pierce? This is Major Ellis of the Royal Armored." The voice interrupted, softer now, almost calm. "Mission complete. The line holds. Ghost Platoon out." Then silence. Ellis sat in the turret long after the radio went dead. When he climbed out, the sun was setting behind the hills, and a thin veil of mist was creeping across the valley floor. He turned once more toward the old Sherman, but it was gone. Where the tank had stood moments ago was only fog, thick, rolling fog, moving as if it had purpose. He called out, "Pierce!" The mist parted slightly, and for a split second, Ellis saw a silhouette inside it. A man standing atop a tank, coat fluttering in the wind, saluting. Then it vanished. The fog rolled on. The next morning, locals found Ellis asleep by the old creek, his coat draped neatly over his shoulders. When they asked what had happened, he just smiled faintly and said, "He's still guarding them. The ghosts never left." From that day forward, strange things began happening at Casino every year near late. July, the anniversary of the Ghost Platoon's final stand. Radio operators on nearby bases would pick up odd transmissions. Static bursts followed by faint words. "Smoke deployed. Hold the line." Farmers claimed to see pale lights drifting across the fields at night, moving in slow formation like tanks on silent patrol. And every so often, a traveler passing through the valley in early morning fog would swear they saw it. A white Sherman tank cresting the ridge, engine humming softly, leaving no tracks behind. It always faced north, toward the front lines it once defended, as if still standing watch. Today, a small plaque rests there, in memory of Captain Roland Pierce and the men of the Ghost Platoon who turned smoke into salvation and death into legend. Their courage lingers in every mist that rises here. When the wind blows across Casino, you can still hear it sometimes, the faint rumble of engines, the echo of orders, and one calm voice through the haze.